Hi, everyone. Welcome to Soul Sense Podcast. We have a special guest today, Amanda McNeil. She has a PhD in psychology and theology, a master's in Christian counseling, and she's a pastor with her husband of a church there in Orlando. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark. I'm really honored to be here.
Hey, we're excited to have you. I'm just excited as I learn more about your book and your teaching. I know you had a book that came out last year called Overcoming the Overcast, Navigating the Storms of Grief with God.
Mm-hmm.
And could you tell us a little about, the foundation for that book, and especially kind of your testimony, things that I know you've had to deal with some real tragedy early on in your life.
Yeah, truly, this book is a love letter from everything that I've been through in my life. And the book isn't solely my story. I weave my story
Mm-hmm.
throughout. But really, the book is, if I could sit down and have coffee for 5 hours with someone going through difficulty, this is everything I would share from my experiences, from my study of the word, from my study of psychology and neuroscience,
Mm-hmm.
and why navigating grief and difficulty is so hard on our
Yeah.
emotions and our physical body. So I knew I was going to write at least one book since I was a teenager. I lost my father tragically and unexpectedly when I was 14 years old. And I remember at the time, Amazon was a thing back then, but just
Mm-hmm.
barely.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to a physical bookstore, and I
Oh,
remember
yes.
going through the Christian bookstore in the teen section and looking for a book about grief, and I
Mm.
couldn't find what I needed when I needed it.
No.
I remember finding a book that was like, "What to do when your pet passes away or when your
Right.
friend moves away," and I
Yeah.
was like, "No, this is not what I need right now." And so this book truly is a love letter to share what I've learned throughout my life.
That is so incredible. Um, Now you were 14. He passes away very suddenly in a terrible accident. You had your mom there with you and maybe some siblings. Did you have church support during that time?
Yes, actually. So at that time, our church had midweek Wednesday service, and he passed away on a Wednesday.
Wow.
And half of the staff wasn't at church, they were at our house.
Wow.
So I remember my youth pastor sitting with me, holding me. Um, my a woman in our church went and took me, not that day, but that week, to go shopping to get a dress for his memorial. And fun fact, that woman ended up becoming my mother-in-law. I wasn't dating her son at the time, but
Whoa.
it truly is beautiful to see how the family of God can make an impact on people in ways that we don't always get to see the fruit of long term, but it's so
Mm,
meaningful.
that is beautiful. So people stepped up and helped you, and then you were reaching out for resources. You couldn't find a good book to help you, but what did you find during those years of 14 to 18? Your such formative years.
Yeah. In my story, those were quite a bit of survival years because
Mhm.
though I was raised in a Christian home and rooted in church community, my mother went through a severe depression. And I actually didn't even know how severe until she had come out of it.
Okay.
So church honestly became a safe haven for me. Of I was there serving and doing the extra leadership classes and
Mhm.
studying the scriptures and doing everything I could. And so that really became quite a great support. At the time, my mother did offer, like, do you want to go to counseling? And as a teenager with very limited experience, I was like, no, counseling's for crazy people. I'm not crazy.
Right. Right.
So of course I didn't need that. But in college, I did start that counseling journey, and a bereavement support group of actually other students who had lost parents was one of the most helpful parts of that healing journey, and being able to honestly name the wounds and the questions and the faith
Mm.
struggles that come from losing such a critical relationship.
Wow. Tell us more about, you said naming the wounds. I think is the phrase you use. Could you tell us about how important that is?
For me, it's incredibly important because I don't think we can heal what we aren't honest about. If I'm okay and I don't need support or I don't need help, why would I be open to receiving help or receiving healing?
Mhm. Mhm.
And when you lose anyone important to you, but especially a tender relationship like an immediate family member, like a parent, there are a lot of ripple effects that you don't always see right away, or you don't always feel right away, or as a child, you don't have the language for. And so, as you become aware of how deep the wound has impacted you, there's more opportunities for healing. And so, a lot of times people will say, well, you're never really done grieving.
Mhm.
And on the one hand, I get what they're saying. But I always like to encourage people, it won't always feel the same in every season of healing.
Mhm.
It's not as heavy, it's not as challenging, and it is hard work, but it's work worth doing.
That's so good. That is so good, Amanda. And you know, I think we have, and I tend to see it more in guys than gals, but I see it in both. And that's like they're actually hurting some way, somehow. And you say, "Hey, how are you doing?" And they go, "Fine. I'm
Mhm.
fine." Right? And years ago, I came up with my own acronym for FINE. I think it stands for false integrity, numbing emotions. What do you think about that?
Goodness. You pull no punches.
And you know, that's kind of the way I interpret fine. You know, honestly, if your friend says they're fine and you think they might not be in a place that they're fine, ask them a deeper question. Come on, tell me a little about how this is going or that is going. But one of the things we talked about before the show that I'd love for you to talk to us about is the difference between grief and bereavement.
Yes, bereavement is a word that we don't often use,
Yeah.
and grief and bereavement are linked.
Hmm.
But bereavement is specifically the mourning or the grief that we go through after the loss of a close loved one, after the death of a close
Okay.
loved one. So we go through bereavement and we see that in funerals, how people react differently, how some people want to talk and share the memories and laugh and look at the pictures, and others are a little more withdrawn or quiet or internal. Grief, there's a lot of definitions, but if I can boil
Hmm.
it down to like the Amanda definition,
Hmm.
grief is sadness or regret over loss.
Okay.
So we have to process our grief when we go through loss of any kind. Um, whether that's moving across the country or not getting the job that you wanted or getting diagnosed with something unexpected. There
Sure.
is sadness associated with loss or regret of how something
Hmm.
happened.
Hmm.
And we are not faithless or bad people or bad Christians for feeling sadness as we
No,
process loss.
that's so good. That is so good because I have heard some ministers that I have great respect for otherwise that kind of preach that, well, Christians shouldn't be sad.
Mm,
Christians shouldn't grieve because we know they're in a better place in this, that, and the other. But I don't really believe that at all from experience, but also from scripture. Look at the great apostle Paul. He said, I almost lost Epaphroditus, and if I had, I would have had grief upon grief.
mm.
Now, unless we think we've advanced to some superior place to the apostle Paul, we're probably going to have grief too when we lose things or lose people.
Yes. We have a whole
But
book called Lamentations.
we do have a book called Lamentations. It's probably a book that a lot of people avoid, but it is very rich, I will say. And but with the bereavement, the after the death of someone that you're close to, after the death, there's a bereavement, and I know that sometimes you'll hear testimonies of people, and they might, just in the sense of condensing it, they'll talk about they lost someone, a spouse, a sibling, a child, a parent, and they condense it, and it may sound like, oh, look, they just got over it and, brushed their hands. And but it is a process, isn't it? Like you said, I mean, there can be birthdays years later that there's still grief there, right? There can be the anniversary of that death years later. Could you tell us a little bit about that to kind of normalize that for people?
Yeah. I think the first year or two obviously are different for everybody depending on who you've lost, what your relationship was with them,
Hmm.
but they're full of triggers
Yes.
because sometimes you're numbing out, but there are dates, like you said, that you can't escape. But there are sometimes, like I remember thinking I saw my dad's face in a crowd. And,
Oh,
like, you just see things that are familiar and smells and different things that remind you, or if the death was connected to anything difficult in a hospital, even just driving by the hospital or something of that nature
right,
can bring you back to that moment. And
right.
so it absolutely is normal to have to process what we can process, what comes up at the time.
Hmm.
In my story, obviously, I was so young. I remember crying. Like, I remember the day he died, crying. He wouldn't walk me down the aisle. He wouldn't hold his grandchildren. And
Right.
so now my son is 9 years old. He hears me talk about my dad. He knows there's sadness connected with his death. He knows the hope of heaven. But still, there are times when, like, he just started getting into soccer as a new passion of his. He wants to become the next Messi.
Oh,
And there
yes.
are times where I've had to cry like, "Oh, he'll never get to share this with my dad."
Right.
And so the grief today doesn't feel the same way as how I carried it over 20 years ago, but
Sure.
there is still those layers of processing and healing.
That's such a beautiful way that you put it. And thank you for sharing that, that intimate part of your story. I think a lot of people are confused, perhaps especially in the early years. They kind of think as the triggers as their enemy,
Mm,
but the triggers are actually the vehicle for grieving, aren't they? You
yes.
must have the triggers to get to the grief. And so I tell people something very simple about triggers. They mean dig here.
Yes, they're signals.
They're signals, right? They're signals. They're important signals. They're not your enemy, right? They're signals. They're signaling something. And yes, of course, the triggers very often are painful. We understand that, some more than others. Part of it is, was it 6 months ago that it happened or 6 years ago? There's a
Sure.
difference in those two, right? But then also, there's those poignant moments where it takes you back. And if you allow yourself, you can take a moment, sow those seeds of tears the Psalms talks about.
Mhm.
And what does the Bible say? When you sow tears, you reap joy.
Yes.
And so tell us a little more about some of the things that you wrote about in navigating the storms of grief.
Yeah. So, I'm very passionate about neuroscience. It's
Okay.
not my specialty. It's something I
Hmm.
study for fun, not for
Sure.
school.
Sure.
But I think it's fascinating that science is now catching up with what the word has declared for thousands of years. And specifically with our brains being a phrase called neuroplastic, it just
Hmm.
means our brains have the capacity to change. And when
Yes.
I say that, I'm not talking in a metaphorical sense or in an internal mental sense. I actually mean physically measurable change.
Yes.
The thoughts we think carve out pathways in our mind.
Hmm.
And so obviously we know Romans talks about daily renewing our mind because we have to set our mind on things above. We have to make sure we're doing that. But I explore how neuroscience teaches us some things about the grief process.
Hmm.
One of my favorite personal revelations is as we study the garden, and as I started writing my book, I didn't have the idea of Genesis as a theme, but it kind of comes
Hmm.
up as a theme in the first half of the book. But when we look at how God wonderfully created Adam and Eve. Of all creation, he said it was good, it was good, it was good. But when he created humans, he said we were very good.
Very good.
When we look at everything God created in his perfect design, death was not a part of it. Death did not enter our earthly story until after sin did.
Yes.
And we know Romans says the wages of sin is death.
Right.
And so I think this helps us reframe a couple of things. First of all, that anytime God gives us a boundary or a directive like, hey, you can eat anything except from that one tree, it's not that he's trying to control or manipulate us.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
is for our blessing and our flourishing and our protection
Yes.
because he has a greater perspective than we do. But I think the second thing that makes that so important is recognizing death is not good. God is the author of life. And
Hmm.
no wonder it hurts so much when we
Mm.
experience the death of someone we love, because
Yes.
by design in Eden, we were never meant to experience death and be able to
No.
process death.
That's profound. So, as you studied it, you really turned towards having that as a foundation for what you taught in the book.
Yes, this, I mean, like I said, it's a lifelong journey, right? But
Mhm.
I've had to
Mhm.
wrestle with God and throw scripture in his face and
Mhm.
say, hey, you say that you work all things together for my good,
Mhm.
but I don't see how you can work good in this situation. But I don't believe you're a liar. So, God, I need you to show up and prove this in my life.
Wow.
And I'm so grateful God could handle my spiciness. God could handle my immaturity. And I think for me, that safety helps me walk alongside others and ensure them like there's no emotion that's too much for God.
Hmm.
Like he can handle whatever you're thinking and whatever you're feeling, even if it's directed at him, go to him with it. He can handle it.
I love that. I love that because, one of the exercises that I've done with so many clients is I have them go back and read Lamentations chapter 3,
Mm,
where Jeremiah, let's just face it, he is letting God have it. You've
yeah.
been playing games with me. I am the object of your wrath. You're like a bear lying in wait. You've put me in chains. You've trapped me, et cetera, et cetera. He goes on for that 19, 20 verses. And I say, read this 3 times slowly. And then I want you to come back with your own letter to God, just like
Mm,
Jeremiah did. And I found that to be a wonderful exercises. And man, I have heard some good ones. Let me tell you.
no
But
filter.
see, yeah, no filter. So many people they say, well, I'm not supposed to be angry with God, so I'm
Mm,
just not going to be. Well, that's like saying your house is not supposed to be on fire, but there's flames coming out the window.
yes.
We need to deal with the reality and not what is supposed to or not supposed to be.
Yes.
Obviously, God has shown us in the word, hey, if you're mad at me, if you have thoughts against me, please be honest with me, because the alternative is being dishonest with me and dishonest with yourself. And so I'm sure that's really something you alluded to. That was part of your journey, right? And part of what you try to teach others. Tell us about that. Being real with God like Jeremiah was in Lamentations 3.
Yeah. So in my book, I use a very similar example of David in the Psalms.
Mhm.
How often do we see him say, Lord, you've forsaken me. Do you not care about me? Do you not hear about my prayers? Why are
Yeah.
my enemies rejoicing and I'm suffering, God? This isn't
Mhm.
fair. I don't like it. Even Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane was like, God, if there's any other way we can make this happen, I pick the other way. I'm
Yes.
suffering. This is hard. I don't want to do it.
Yes.
But what I appreciate about David in the Psalms is he'll say all this honest stuff,
Mhm.
and then he directs himself what to do. He says,
Mm.
Yet my soul will trust in my Savior. I will rejoice in the Lord. And I think that's so powerful because, as we talked about earlier, we can't heal what we don't feel or what we're not
Mm,
honest about.
mm.
So when we are honestly naming these pains, then we can do something about it and we're not a victim to just the feelings. We actually can make a plan to work through the feelings.
I love that. And we can't heal what we don't feel. And so we have to get out of denial,
Yeah.
right? The people that listen to the podcast know that I've talked about years ago. I was meditating on Revelation 3, where obviously the Laodiceans are in denial, right?
Mm,
They're in denial. Oh, we're rich and increase with goods. We have need of nothing. So one of the things that doesn't work in our relationship with God is to ever come to him and say, "Oh, I'm not needy. I don't need you." Right? And so I was thinking about, Lord, they're in denial, but what's the definition of denial?
mm,
And so, I know denial is about reality, it's about truth, but what comes before that? And it just kind of dropped into my spirit. Denial is rebellion from reality.
wow.
And the Bible says, rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. So, do you mean if I'm in denial, I might be performing witchcraft on myself?
Wow.
Right? And so
It's creating a false reality.
it's creating a false reality. If I say, oh, I'm fine. Oh, no, I'm not mad at God. Oh, yeah, I got over that a long time ago. How many times in my 30 years of counseling have said, oh, that's resolved. Oh, I've worked on that. And I'll be like, gently, but like, well, then it won't hurt to ask a few questions and just see if it hurts here.
Hmm.
Right. Because so many times people make the mistake of saying, oh, it was 10 years ago and I can tell the story without crying or whatever. Okay, but now let's go back to that scene where you're standing by your dad's casket. And I want you to lay hands on that little girl or that 14-year-old or 8-year-old
Hmm.
or whatever the grief is and tell me what she's feeling. Because so often there's that disconnect, right?
Yes, and it's survival. It's what we learn to survive.
It
It's what
is.
we learn is socially acceptable because
Mm-hmm.
people don't like talking about grief. People
Yeah.
want you to feel better because they love you.
Yeah.
And so there's this expectation you should be past it after a year or 10 years or whatever it
Right.
is.
Right.
And so we can pretend all day long and we can suppress for a long time. But I always say it's like you're in the ocean holding a beach ball underwater. You might be able to do it for a long time, but inevitably some storm is going to come and
Yep.
that beach ball is going to pop right back up. And
Yes.
time doesn't heal all wounds.
Mm-mm.
We have to address it and get in the pain to work through it.
That's good. That's so good. I tell people it's fine to bury things. We just don't bury them alive.
Mm,
And, it's just not right to bury things alive, right? Not your pet, not grandpa, anything else. And
yeah,
so, what do I have to do as counselors?
that's so
We're
good.
looking for things that have been buried, but not given a proper burial. They haven't been given that proper send off. And so, whether it's personal trauma or sexual abuse or physical abuse or terrible bereavement like you went through, if it's something that's not resolved, whether I'm offended with God or whether I just didn't have the opportunity or the understanding of how to grieve, we come back and we have to take care of that unfinished business.
Yes. Yeah, and we don't like that as humans because that's slow,
Yeah.
that's inconvenient, that's
Hmm.
painful. I would rather be past my problems, I would rather be past my pain, and yet it is by caring and meeting our younger self or meeting ourselves
Hmm.
in that place of
Hmm.
need that I think then we can invite Jesus in
That's right.
because we're being honest, and that's where transformation happens, is where we can give and receive care. So yeah, this is why that's why I say it's hard work, but it is work worth doing, and it can be slow. We all want
Yes.
the after. We all want the transformation story. But in my experience, Can God supernaturally heal and restore something or someone or a broken relationship? Absolutely, he can and he does. But
Mhm.
also, going back to my friend Genesis, we also see he's a God of process, that
Mhm.
he designed one thing and the next day he built on top of that. And I often find that is a process in our own healing journeys, that it is one layer at a time, which can feel so slow, but
Mhm.
that's what makes it sustainable.
That's so good, Amanda. Could you give us an example, and maybe you can compile a couple of different clients or give us an example. Someone walks in and maybe they present, listen, I had this great loss, this great bereavement, but I've just been stuck and I need some help. What are some of the first things you might do in those first maybe few sessions and working with them to help untangle that and unpack it and start getting them in the right track?
Yeah, I always like to explore and just ask, what have you done for yourself in the grief process so far? What has that support looked like?
Mhm.
Because sometimes people will try a session and say, oh, that didn't work for me. Or sometimes people
Right.
will confide in a pastor or a friend but not feel better. And a lot of times we define that word, that phrase self care, as something kind of trite, like a bubble bath or getting your nails done, which
Mhm.
I'm not opposed to that, love getting my nails done, but
Right.
self-care is truly caring for ourself, body, soul, and spirit. And so that takes a lot of components. And oftentimes, people don't recognize what they have done to support themselves. Now, not every support is necessarily healthy or productive, but we can support ourselves with numbing out, with
Mhm.
addictions or shopping or screen time or whatever it is. We can support ourselves by burying things temporarily. We can
Mhm.
support ourselves by taking up boxing classes and trying to get out our aggression. Like, there's lots of different things we
Right.
can do
Right.
with various degrees of health. And sometimes helping people see what they already have in the toolkit and recognize it, but maybe redirecting it or engaging it more intentionally can
Mhm.
be very helpful, because you do feel overwhelmed in grief and in bereavement. You do feel like it will never end. And so
Mhm.
finding those small, manageable steps are everything. I also am a huge proponent, as I mentioned earlier from my own story, of people getting into a support group. And a
Mhm.
lot of times that can sound so intimidating. Oftentimes, I will hear clients say, like, I can't handle my own sadness and depression. I don't want to hear a bunch of other sad stories.
Right.
Or they'll feel fear being vulnerable and being strange. And I just share from my own experience. And I always assure people, group facilitators are trained to facilitate a group to keep it safe feeling,
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
help ask healthy questions. There's no
Mhm.
pressure for anyone to share or to support, or to say anything that they don't want to say. And you actually will be maybe surprised at how hearing somebody else's experience or emotion or processing can help normalize what you're going through, maybe help point you to a resource you weren't aware of before, or even just give you language of like, "Ah, you too, I'm not crazy."
It's good.
And so it's so powerful to surround ourselves with community who understands. Of course, they're not going to understand exactly what you're going through,
Right.
but they'll understand a measure of it, and that's healing.
That's so good, Amanda. And I know there's so many pieces and parts of this, but um, how did you navigate, or how do you try to help people navigate with sometimes various degrees of anger towards the person they lost?
Mm,
Of course, you know, your your dad, you said, just died tragically. Of course, some people, they smoked themselves to death,
mhm,
right? Or they got drunk and they were in a car accident. There's all kinds of ways that people can, you can lose someone. Some through, of course, no fault of their own, and there's a
yeah.
whole continuum. But in any of those cases, I found that it could be important to actually forgive the person they lost. What could you speak to about that? Because sometimes, well, it just doesn't make sense to forgive someone. It was just an accident and they had no control, but they
Mhm.
still abandoned you. They still did, even though they didn't choose to. So
Yes.
that's kind of a complicated thing, isn't it?
Yes. And I'm so glad you brought this up. Forgiveness is one of the number one topics I talk about with every client. It comes up at some point in all of our
Yes.
stories.
Yes.
And I think, again, we have to go to the word to wrestle with what is my idea or definition of forgiveness?
Hmm.
And does it actually line up with what God's intention or design for
Hmm.
forgiveness is? So I like to detangle that because if we think forgiveness means, oh, stamp of approval that everything happened was okay, we're
Right.
wrong. If
Right.
we view forgiveness as, oh, everything goes back to normal, no, of course not, especially in the case of a death.
Sure.
So I like to describe forgiveness as a one-way street.
Hmm.
It is something you choose to engage in. You don't always feel like it, but
No.
you choose to forgive the emotional debt that the person could not repay.
Right.
And they don't have to know about it. You don't have to have a conversation with them. It is a one-way street coming from you, and spiritually, that changes everything because it puts
Hmm.
you in right standing with God the Father.
Hmm.
But emotionally, that changes everything because you're no longer carrying around this weight of something that cannot be resolved, cannot be repaid. And so you're choosing to set the weight down. And in contrast, I'll say relationship restoration is a two-way street where both parties take ownership, both parties are participating to rebuild trust. And so, unfortunately, we will not have relationship restoration with every person who has harmed us, but
Right.
we absolutely can, and in my opinion, need to access forgiveness.
It's so good because, we understand that that unforgiveness, we've talked about being offended with God, so it could be towards God. Of course, it could be towards ourselves. We haven't talked about that much, but that can
Mhm,
come into play, regret and self-contempt. But then towards others. In Ephesians chapter 4, it says, "Submit therefore to God." Excuse me, that's James. Uh, Be angry and yet do not sin. Don't
mhm,
let the sun go down in your anger, and do not give the devil an opportunity or a place. And so, as you forgive, as you release that anger, even for something that, like in your father's case, he didn't do anything wrong, it was a tragic accident, but he still left you.
yeah,
And so, just that honesty about, Dad, I know you didn't do anything wrong, but it feels like a debt. And so I forgive you.
mhm,
And of course, like we said, there's a continuum because sometimes there is some more personal responsibility. If you smoked for decades and got cancer, or if you got drunk and drove and died that way in that kind of tragedy, of course there's that continuum. But even in your case, where your dad didn't do anything wrong, um, still that ability to that acknowledging that there may be need to be a release of something. And I found that to be something that is often unexamined with my clients, that they could hold it against themselves. But could we talk for a minute? I don't know if you had any of this, but a lot of times when people have a loss of someone they so love and they're so close to, they can have regret, or what if I'd done this, or why
mhm.
didn't I do that? And how do you help people with that?
Ooh, that is a great question. And I actually think it is normal for the brain to process that. And this I talk about in a chapter in my book too,
Mhm, mhm.
because we are looking for a logical justification of why it happened. So, in the case of a medical emergency, if only I had fill in the
Yes.
blank,
Yes.
or even a loved one struggling with addiction. If I
Mhm,
had been more stern, or if I had
mhm,
insisted on
mhm.
rehab, or if,
More
if,
stern or
if.
less stern, more rehab or less rehab, or took them there or didn't take them there. It's all sides, right?
Yes. And so that guilt, that personal responsibility is our brain's way of looking to find logic.
Yes.
But in my opinion, there is no logic because as humans, we weren't designed to process grief, going back to Genesis.
Right.
So we will look for reasons to try to make us feel better. And oftentimes we are the source of that I should have fill in the blank. So I think there's something to embracing. I believe that God is sad at death, at tragedy,
Yeah.
no matter how the death occurs. I believe God is compassionate with us. He is near to the brokenhearted. And so reframing, it's not about me not coming through or me not being enough. It is about sometimes because I live in a fallen world where sin exists, not even necessarily the sin of the deceased or my
Mm-hmm.
own personal sin, but just by the
Mm-hmm.
fact that we live in an earth affected by sin, there are consequences outside of our control. And for me, I think that's part of an acceptance of where I have to make peace with I have to honor the efforts that I did make. I have to receive grace from the Lord where I failed, and trust that at the end of the day, God is in control, and
Mm.
that's hard. It's a platitude we often hear, but I don't say that flippantly. I can say that from a place of conviction that I truly did have to make peace with. Do I believe my dad's accident was God's desire? Of course not. But can he use it for good? Can he
Mm-hmm.
redeem it in my life and in my
Mm-hmm.
family's life? Yes, he can.
That's
And I
so
think
good.
one more little
No,
thing,
go ahead.
and
Yeah.
this is just, I think this is the childlike part of me. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I would love for everything to have neat answers, for God to just have an open dialogue with me and explain himself to me. But I've just come to the conclusion that I think there are some things we might not have answers to until eternity. And even then, we might not get every answer we want in eternity either.
I remember poignantly hearing a story of a dear believer in Africa. She wrote in her testimony in her book decades ago that she had went through a great time of loss and bereavement with a number of family members and people close to her. And it was so much, it was so overwhelming. She decided to go on a prayer and a fast just alone with the Lord for several days. And as I recall, it was about on the third day or the fifth day, I can't quite recall, she got a clear connection with the Lord.
Mm,
Only he asked her a question: will you trust me even if I never tell you why?
mm,
And of course, that's one of the hardest questions to get and one of the hardest questions to answer, but also one of the most important ones because part of grieving is facing the test of offense toward God and overcoming that.
yep,
And that's not just a snap of the fingers, right?
mm-mm,
I'm sure she had to sit with that for days or weeks or even months. Um, but praise God, she got to a point of saying yes. I
mm,
can honestly, with integrity, say yes. And I believe one of the more profound verses in scripture is Psalm 27:10. And it says, when my father and my mother forsake me, then the Lord will take care of me. In the
mm.
King James, it's a little more poetic. Then the Lord will take me up.
Wow.
But for you, it was 14 with your dad. For me, it was like 40 with my dad, right?
Mm,
So it was much later and much more like we might expect it. He was a ripe old age. Um, but I know it was still hard. It was
yeah,
hard when my father forsook me, you know? And it was hard when your father forsook you. And you notice that it doesn't say if my father and mother forsake me.
yeah,
It says when.
yep,
And I just I just am so appreciative for the path that you've walked, Amanda, with your testimony, and now helping others with grief and with relationships and in your church. You come from such a rich history and foundation, and I know that I have so much more trust in caregivers who have been through the grief, who have been through the loss, and
Yeah.
have been able to overcome it, not bury it, but overcome it.
Hmm. Yeah. The final picture in my book, why I named the whole thing Overcoming the Overcast.
Yes.
I actually use a picture of an airplane because I was around
Hmm.
planes my whole life.
Okay.
Um, but when you are on the earth in a storm, you obviously, anytime we're on earth, we have a limited perspective.
Sure.
But you could be surrounded by a storm. It's gray, it's cloudy, you can't see clearly as you're navigating. But as soon as you, in an airplane, break through the cloud line,
Mm.
the sun is still shining like it always is.
Wow.
You just couldn't feel it at that other perspective. And for me, I think that's such a picture of grief is that the Son of God is always shining in our lives, even when we don't see him, even when we don't feel him.
Hmm.
And the storm of grief is strong, but it will not last forever. You will feel the sunshine again. That's my story. That is my firm belief for others. And it's an honor to be able to support others as they wrestle with their own questions on the journey, too.
Thank you so much, Amanda. A beautiful way to end. And what's the best way to access you or your teachings and your book?
Yeah, so I have a website, amandacmcneil.com. All
Okay.
my books are there, and I'd love to give the first chapter of my book free to everyone in your audience. It's just
Excellent.
amandacmcneil.com/free. They can get
Okay.
that first chapter and just see if that resonates with them.
Thank you so much. We'll put all the information on the podcast. It's been so good talking with you. Thank you for sharing your heart and your story and your experience, Amanda.
It's my honor. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. If you enjoyed this podcast, please do us a favor and like, subscribe, and share with others who might need it. And you can find additional resources at SamaritansWell.com.